And even the best, the most conservative, and the one that will for sure survive Ayala Land is down 50% from the peak.
Yes.
You know, this is the best and the steadiest, but it's still down 50%. You can imagine how the other cowboys are.
Yeah, there's one that's down 70, another down 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when people are...
I think a lot of them will go bust.
So this credit growth slowdown and the slowdown in the global economy that it will spawn. Right now, the centers of the crisis is in Europe and in the U.S.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that the crisis may have started in the U.S., but I think other countries will be in a worse shape than the U.S. Because if you think about it, the U.S. economy is an economy, I mean, simply put, very simply put, that doesn't produce anything, it just consumes. Since 70% of GDP is consumption. What then happens is, if consumption goes up, they import a lot, and you then have the trade and current account deficit growing. And if consumption then in the US goes down, obviously the producers of goods for the US are the ones that are hit the most, not the US itself. In the US, say in the US, if consumption was down 10%, it's of course bad for retailers. It's good for lowering the obesity of Americans, you know, and the country would be much healthier if they actually consumed 10% less in every respect. You know, they would use less oil, they would use less electricity, it would be a much greener society, and they would reduce the consumption of food. There's an abundance of food, of everything in the United States. So actually for the US, from a social point of view, it would be very good if consumption dropped 10%. But I can assure you, for the producers in Asia that supply the US, a 10% drop from the US would be a disaster. Then what happens, if they sell less to the US, the next thing to happen is that as the US economy expanded 2001 to 2007, the production in Asia rose very strongly, employment went up, industrial production went up, the demand for commodities went up, and since this was perceived to last, capital spending went up. So the demand for commodities was driven not just by industrial production, but also by capacity expansion, you know, to build new factories, the infrastructure, you needed steel and cement and copper and so forth and so on. And when that goes into reverse, then the demand for commodities obviously goes down very quickly. And that then hits the resource producers of the world. And actually, if you look at the market action since 2002, first, during the expansion, the markets that go up the most are emerging markets and the resource producers. That is natural because they are the prime beneficiary from excessive consumption in the US and from low, let's say, excess liquidity that came from the growth of the current account deficit in the US. When things go into reverse, the markets actually reacted absolutely correctly. The US is down, say, 30% or 35% from the peak, but the emerging markets are down something like 50%, sometimes 60%. So actually they reacted rationally. And because their economies are going to get hit harder than the US. Now, I may say this, the emerging economies could get hit harder than the US, but they are also likely to recover at some stage again, because structurally in the world we are in a period of huge changes, in the sense that after the Second World War we were an America-centered global economy, and I think we're moving away from that, where America is no longer as important relative to the rest of the world as it used to be, and you have new powers coming up like China, India, and Russia to some extent, and so forth. So we will have a very different geopolitical set of conditions in future than we had post-Second World War.
So one can say that the recovery for emerging markets will be quicker than...
I think that once the markets bottom out, and I believe the bottoming out process will actually take some time. It's not a market low from where you will rally 100% just like this. I think the low will be followed by a base building period. If you look at the performance of Asian markets after the 97-98 crisis, they collapsed, and then they made a low, and then they rallied into 2000, but then they went down again and bottomed out in 2002, 2003. So essentially 5 years after the crisis, you had still a bottoming out process. And I'd just like to mention, in US dollar terms, the Philippine stock market is today still down more than 50% from the peak in 97 in dollar terms. In Thailand, we're down something like 70% from the peak in 1997. So, when you ask me about new bull markets, we will have to define in what currency and how to express the new bull market. But I think in future people will ask you, are you born before or after 2007? Because the world will have changed in 2007. It's like for years and years people said, are you born before the war or after the war? Or were you born before 1929 or after 1929? Well, there was a huge shift in the global economy in the sense that the Depression followed, which was a very hard time, and then the Depression led, especially in Germany, to the rise of Hitler and so forth. And we had a totally different world thereafter, and I think 2007 is kind of these milestone events in the world. Like 1980 to 82, we also have a milestone. We have the peak of inflation and the bottom of the bond market globally and bottom of equity markets globally. So these milestones are important to keep in mind, and I think 2007 was one, and the world after 2007 will be a different world.
Yeah. In this report, you mentioned the regions, countries vulnerable to this will be Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Russia, Middle East, and even Brazil.
The ones that suffer?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. The resource-producing countries, yes.
Yeah. So, and yet people are saying the India and China, for example, have huge domestic demand, and that's their argument that...
Yeah, sure, that I understand, but this domestic demand may not grow as much as is or was expected.
Yeah.
And as I said, one has to be very careful what was true domestic demand, what was also credit-driven, and what demand for commodities came from capital spending. Because if you take a scenario that the world has slow economic growth, capital spending plans will be cut. And my estimate of global capital spending would be that it is down in 2009 and not up, and that has a huge implication on the demand for commodities. But as I said, I mean, the difficulty at the present time, it's difficult to make forecasts about markets regardless. But when you have the casino owner changing the rules all the time, it's very difficult for the gamblers to cope with it. Because he doesn't know how the rules will suddenly affect his gambling strategy. And the casino owner today is the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board and other central banks and other fiscal authorities. And they can change the rules very quickly. And in theory, they can print money like crazy. That they can do.